We begin a series, Hermetic America. This is the first presentation, and I thought I would begin with a prelude to let you know how this came about. From the late 1950s through the 1960s, I was involved both at the University of Wisconsin and later on in San Francisco in the great movements of the time. All of my mentors as a freshman at the University of Wisconsin were old graduate students, and Madison, Wisconsin was the seed and hotbed of a deep split. The state of Wisconsin, half of it was progressive and liberal, and half of it was Joseph McCarthy, radical right. The northern part of the state and the middle part of the state, Joseph McCarthy was originally from an area called Tomahawk, Wisconsin, which explains a great deal. But the southern part of the state, focused on Madison, the University of Wisconsin, was one of the early centers of the progressive movement in American politics. And the University of Wisconsin was in particular one of the great pioneering universities to develop the liberal arts education with an eye towards preparing people who would be active in the progressive movement. To refresh just for a moment, the progressive movement was Theodore Roosevelt through Woodrow Wilson. And they were in reaction to the Reconstruction era after the American Civil War. And as everyone knows, but it is important always to recall the pivot of the Civil War, was that it culminated in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The death of Lincoln put on hold the bringing of the Union back into play. The Civil War had been won on the basis of keeping the Union, but Lincoln's assassination put it on hold, where it has largely been since that day. What followed was called the period of Reconstruction, but it's better known as the age of the robber barons. Mark Twain, in his Hermetic American Insight, called it the Gilded Age. None of it is gold, but it is all gilded to look like gold. Stock certificates are gilded to look like gold, deals are gilded, and men become gilded by those who have money and power and who intend to own that money and power indefinitely. The progressive movement was meant to counter that, and it brought into American politics a reaching back to an era before Lincoln, but through the figure of Lincoln. Back to the era which was characterized many times as the era of feeling good. And the era of feeling good owes its genesis to a pivotal figure, Thomas Jefferson. Even though Thomas Jefferson was the third president, when he came into office in 1800, it's called the Revolution of 1800. Because the period from the Revolutionary War to Jefferson's inauguration, that period of about 20 years, the Revolutionary War was largely won about 1783. And it took a while for that to process. And it took almost 5 years before there was a constitutional convention making the Constitution. And in that time period, a very power-hungry group centered around Alexander Hamilton vied for power behind and through the Constitutional Convention deal making. In order to get this done, we must make deals. And the pivotal figure in that constitutional deal making on the other side was James Madison. So that when you look at American history as a political phenomenon, it begins not with the Constitution, but with the fight over deal making between the Hamilton and the Madison groups. And that argument is what the Federalist Papers are. And so American history as a political phenomenon does not begin with the Constitution. It begins with the Federalist Papers. An appendix to the Federalist Papers became an appendix to the Constitution because of Thomas Jefferson, who was not in the Constitutional Convention because he was representing as minister plenipotentiary in Paris, in France. And the figure who preceded him there was Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin was the one who made sure that the context of victory for the Revolutionary War would occur. And we will see that constantly behind the scenes. The first American is Benjamin Franklin. He is characteristic, but he characteristically brings the entire scope of the civilized world into a focus in his life so that he became the writing pen of aspirations of mankind. And one of the most sharp prisms of those aspirations of mankind came from the Renaissance. And the most potent vision of the Renaissance was of the New World. We remember the date 1492, even though we now recognize that there were Norse travelers to North America 500 years before that, when Jefferson sent out across the continent reconnaissances of the American Indians, a tribe now extinct, the Mandan tribe in the northern part of the Dakotas, had blue eyes. They were descendants of Norse travelers 1,000 years ago who got as far inland as the center of the continent. And there are many other aspects which we will come to appreciate. But 1492 is the date. Columbus discovers America. It becomes a new world, the New World vision, and the United States became the manifestation of the great vision of the New World of the Renaissance. And so the idea of the United States that came first into seed in Benjamin Franklin, we will see that he once had a beautiful illustration that he published of a snake, a serpent, cut into 13 parts and labeled with the initials of the 13 colonies. Divided we fall, united we stand. And the first American flag was not the Stars and Stripes, but the serpent made whole, and the motto was, "Don't tread on me." We must learn to make a distinction between the political structures that present and at the same time mask America with the actual Americans who have made it the promise fulfilled of that Renaissance prism, which itself hearkened all the way back to the great achievements of the classical world. And so when we are talking about Hermetic America, we are not talking about military histories, though we could. It was Benjamin Franklin whose judgment of men was poignant enough to pick out a 19-year-old Marquis named Lafayette and send him to General Washington because he said, "You need a viable genius on the field." And even at 19, the Marquis de Lafayette was really someone. He is the one who assured that the Battle of Yorktown would be the final real battle of the Revolutionary War. Later on, the Marquis de Lafayette became the guarantor for a while that the French Revolution would have a mellower, broader base. And when he was out of the country, out of France, is when the whole movement of the French Revolution crashed into the Terror, into the Directorate. But it was again Lafayette who came back later and brought the French Republic back into play so that it could again assume a quality of dignity in human history. Before the French Revolution, there was a Lafayette, and after there was a Lafayette. In the American Revolution, there was a Lafayette. And on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the old Lafayette came to visit America and was lionized. There were Lafayettes named everywhere in the new country. Lafayette, Indiana, Lafayette here, everywhere. The first person he went to was the old Thomas Jefferson, still alive, and their meeting was chronicled. "Ah, Monsieur Jefferson. Ah, Monsieur Lafayette." And they embraced. This is a Hermetic America moment. And years later, when one of the most poignant American authors got into drilling satirical remarks about Jefferson while he was in France, James Fenimore Cooper, the Marquis de Lafayette, aged but still in full possession, invited James Fenimore Cooper out to La Grange, to his country estate, and there, over a period of days, informed him about the truth of Thomas Jefferson and of America and of Benjamin Franklin. And James Fenimore Cooper became one of the finest Hermetic Americans and wrote a classic, not of political criticism, but of a critique of the nature of man settling for the masks of power rather than the energies of freedom. And it's called The American Democrat. And it's still in print over 100 years later. We will look at all of these people and their generations that came after. But what we need to understand poignantly is that the Renaissance as a lens, like a prism, brought back into play many hidden energies that had been forgotten or had been recast such that they were nullified by the masks of power, by political and military authorities for more than 1,000 years. We used to call that period the Dark Ages. The core of the Renaissance was assumed in Florence, Italy, by one of the most interesting figures in world history, Cosimo de' Medici. The young Cosimo had been banished from Florence by a family, the Abruzzi, and had gone to Venice, not in shame, but as a young man whose family had banks all over Europe and was quite in possession of an enormous sophistication of how power really works, did not fear the Abruzzi threat at all, but took his vacation in Venice to become acquainted with the art and the culture there, because he was also quite an extraordinary figure, and it was there he made friends with all of the religious leaders of the time who were trying to have a Christian conference of the falling Byzantine Orthodox Christianity and the trying to resuscitate its power Roman Catholic Christianity, and to bring them together, and they were going to have a great conference in Venice. He got it moved to Florence. And in 1439, that conference was held. Just before that, he rode back into Florence on a white horse with all of his Renaissance regalia and his entourage. And when they rode past the empty Abruzzi palace, he simply stood up in his stirrup and from his seat and silently passed in front of it back into Florence, where the Medicis became one of the great families of world history. In order to carry his vision, he picked a young man to educate to the best degree that a young man could be educated, both by the East and the West aspects of European life. And that young man was the son of his physician, and the young man's name was Marsilio Ficino. And so he had Marsilio Ficino educated by the best, not only in terms of teachers and tutors, but to acquaint him with how man works. That men of distinction and power and money can be just as noble and royal as those who are outside of this venue. And so young Ficino grew up to be one of the master educators and philosophers of all time. He began translating for the old Cosimo a huge tome of the manuscripts of Plato that he had collected at great expense and great trouble, so that he would have a complete translation of Plato into the modern languages that were current at the time. And just as Ficino was at the white-hot center of translating Plato, a manuscript of the Hermetica came into Cosimo's hands. Now, the Hermetica are the secret core of the apex of classical wisdom. And the reason why they are the apex of the core of classical wisdom is a subject of a great spiral that I have worked on a great deal of time. And in this series, I will present not only what that is and how it functions, but why it is that we live now at an energy threshold of its reemergence. Now, to condense this a little bit so that you can not be stretched out too much all at once, I will return to all of these themes. Let me say that when I was finished with the 60s in San Francisco, I lived in Berkeley towards the end of it. My house on College in Derby was where the lines were drawn every time there was demonstrations, and just to get home from the grocery store, you were frisked and sometimes beaten by the batons, and especially because I was conspicuous in the anti-war movement and many other movements. I was conspicuous because I was the prize teaching assistant at San Francisco State during the last half of the 60s and knew all of the figures personally who made the San Francisco Renaissance. Almost all of them are dead. There's only one left alive that I'm still in contact with. Jacob Needleman still survives all this while. To quote Pablo Neruda from the heights of Machu Picchu, "The shadow of the condor cruising over the ancient stones survives us all this while." I was offered an unprecedented opportunity to go to Canada to design a 16-course interdisciplinary program because I had as much experience as anyone in the world at the time of working with interdisciplinary learning, interdisciplinary education, and went to Canada. When I went to Canada, to Calgary, Alberta, in 1970, in the spring, American history was a required subject in Canada and had several hundred students in the college that I went to, Mount Royal. The universities across Canada were filled with students in American history. And during that period, American history was taken out of its niche as a required subject. And when I left in 1975, there were 6 people in American history studying, and many professorships were let go. And when I came back to the United States, having achieved a great program, I sent out from my chair, I was a tenured professor by that time, head of the department, I sent out 60 letters to explore what was going on in American education all this while. I received only one reply from Norman O. Brown from the University of California at Santa Cruz, the head then of the History of Consciousness program that had been founded in 1966 by one of the most distinguished groups of people in the world. Page Smith in American history, Maurice Nathanson in existential philosophy, Norman O. Brown himself, a great classicist who was the author of 2 extraordinary books read by everyone in the 60s. Anyone who read Tolkien, anyone who read The Immense Journey by Lauren Isley, also read Love's Body by Norman O. Brown. And his previous book, Life Against Death, is an examination of the Freudian implications of money in European history and the psyche. Extraordinary. But Norman O. Brown's first book is Hermes the Thief, published in 1940s. Brown wrote back, he said, "They're all gone. There is no History of Consciousness program left. There is a program called History of Consciousness, but everyone has left, and I am leaving too. It is no sense to come here. education has lost its way. And this was only 9 years after the program had been founded with great fanfare. It is important for us to go back prismatically to the Renaissance, back to Florence, back to the fact that at the core of the Platonic revival is the Hermetic revival. And it is the Hermetica which presents pristinely and points very directly to the major figure who inherits the entire pyramid, the entire light cone of wisdom in the ancient classical world. That Hermetica points to Plotinus. And Plotinus, living in the 3rd century, born about 204, died of diphtheria in Rome about 269. Among his students were the emperor and the empress, Aurelian, many Roman senators, many distinguished people. Plotinus always had a dozen or so young people living in his palatial home because he was trusted as a guardian, as a tutor. And it is Plotinus's spoken deliveries that are collected together, selected, and arranged in what is today one of the classics of planetary history called the Aeneas. The Hermetica point to Plotinus, and Plotinus as a jewel lens sparkles scintillatingly and lets it fan out again with a renewed energy, as if he is not just a prism, but he's an energizing transformer. And out of this comes an energized Hermetica that comes through as Neoplatonism. And that Neoplatonic quality of secret wisdom blossomed into a workable cosmos of visionary perspective, capable of being sustained by science, capable of being expressed by art, became the very core of the wisdom that was revived in the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, you had, for the very first time in 1,000 years, universities' core is that the arts and sciences are part of a harmonic set, and they go together. The critique of the arts and the analytic of the sciences are a resonant parenthesis around the spiritual person as a jeweled prism of consciousness, which is able to reach back into the 4 dimensions of space and time with a quintessential 5th dimension like the movable thumb, so that you can take hold of existence and things and actions and get something done. Though it is a crucial moment like the American Civil War, a carrier of that Hermetic tradition like Abraham Lincoln was able to hold the vision of the United States firm so that it stayed there, though it was hijacked by an age of the robber barons, familiar to us in the past decades of the United States. Since 1968, America had been hijacked. It is coming back 40 years after the wilderness. One of the interesting events a year ago was that in Springfield, Illinois, the State House where Abraham Lincoln served before he went to the White House, not far from his law offices in Springfield, On the steps of that State House is where Barack Obama decided that it was time for someone to speak directly to the American people, not in political terms, but in terms of appealing to them to come out and participate again, to redo whatever has to be redone, but to do it. Yesterday, we had the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In that April 4th, 1968, all of us in San Francisco, the San Francisco Berkeley people, absolutely disheartened by the turn of event, gathered in the San Francisco Mime Troupe rehearsing hall and saw a television broadcast live from Indianapolis, Indiana, that evening, where Robert F. Kennedy, who was a candidate for president at the time, was campaigning in Indiana, in Indianapolis, which is right in the center of the state. And he was in the black area of Indianapolis in a sea of thousands and thousands of largely black men. And Robert Kennedy stood bareheaded and delivered the news that Martin Luther King had been shot dead in Memphis. There was a moment of seething disbelief, roiling with anger, and then it focused on the white man, the young white man facing them, who did not flinch, who spoke to them quietly and said, "I am able to sympathize with you. It has only been a few years since my family has suffered what you are suffering now. And you suffered with us then. When my brother was assassinated, I am here to stand with you in your suffering tonight." Indianapolis became the only major American city that had no riots that night, because the resonance of a Hermetic carrier is a harmonic. It goes through walls, it goes through the masks, it goes through the false authority structures and finds its way. And those human beings who are able to receive that tone understand spontaneously, not through the mind, but through the heart that has been touched by their consciousness, that this is truth. The Greek word is aletheia. Plato said pro and con. If you actually listen to each other, there are stages that develop in that dialogue, and you will come eventually to a stage where you understand each other, and that is the truth. That your mutual understanding is tunable so that it is a single sound. Robert Kennedy told the working class black mass of men that night the commensurate fellow suffering, and in the midst of it, he lapsed classical. He quoted Aeschylus to that crowd of black working class men 40 years ago in Indianapolis. If we allow fear to be loose in our streets, our days will only be filled with terror. We must not do that, and we must work together not to let that choice inadvertently come into play. Barack Obama stood on that same spot in Indianapolis last night that Robert Kennedy spoke at, and again brought back Hermetic America, as he had done the year before, standing where Lincoln stood to decide to become president against all wisdom at the time. The president was already decided in Lincoln's day was going to be Stephen A. Douglas, who was a masterful speaker, had the contacts with the power structure, was one of the Clintons of his day. And the Lincoln-Douglas debates, like the Federalist Papers, are a part of American history. My family went to Illinois when it was an Indian territory. My family founded West Union, Illinois, just west of the Wabash River, and I'm named for George Rogers Clark, a Revolutionary War general who was a family friend. All of my ancestors were doctors. One of my ancestors in the War of 1812 had to swim ashore in Charleston, South Carolina, because his ship was sunk by the American Navy. And when it was discovered that he was a prize surgeon, he was pressed into military service immediately. And the group that commandeered him had the authority to do it. It was Andrew Jackson. And when the War of 1812 was rapidly finished, my ancestor Hugh Weir was told, "We're not paying you, but we will give you a sheepskin land grant to new territory on the other side of the Wabash River. It's called Illinois Territory. And you're free to get your family back from Scotland and move there," which he did. When I was 12, I'm a seventh generation of that family. My grandfather, who had died before I was born of a diabetic complication brought on by unusual circumstance. I never met him, but I was being taken around to meet all the Weirs, who were all doctors all throughout central and south Illinois. And I also met my great-great-aunt, Maida Weir, who lived to be 104. She had raised my grandfather, whose father had died before he was mature. And she's the one that gave the family history. And then turned to my father and said, "Be sure now to take him to Springfield, to see the Lincoln House, to see the Lincoln State House." And she said, "I saw Lincoln as a girl. And I want you to know that we are all still Lincoln people. You are a Lincoln person. And you need to go and get the contact." When we come back from the break, we'll talk about the contact resonance that accrues into a harmonic set in between the arts and the sciences. That harmonic is called history. It is the artists and the scientists of the cosmos that hold elegantly that harmonic of tones which we really do live by consciously. Let's take a break. Let's come back to the genesis of my book, of which this series of DVDs will be a contextual presentation. The origin of the book, Hermetic America, came from a previous book which I wrote and put together in 1983, finally, after working on it for about 3 years. And it was entitled The Hermetic Roots of America. And the subtitle of the book, Ficino's Renaissance to Franklin's Republic. Ptolemy Philadelphus to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Because Philadelphia will figure prominently again and again in Hermetic America, as will Boston, as will places like Monticello, as will places like Illinois, and all the rest of this great country, this great land. The reason for writing Hermetic Roots of America is interesting. When I came back to the United States in 1975, after being out for 5 years, I came back with a tight program which could only be offered partly in the formal education. And I wanted to set up an 8-semester-long sequence of courses that would function as an overall new kind of program, a new kind of an education. The origins of that kind of, we can't say it's a revolution in education, though we could, I suppose, and we can't say it's a reformation. It's a little tired now to say that it's a renaissance. So what I had said of it was that it's a recalibration of learning. And I telescoped all the great educational recalibrations from world history, East and West. The progressive movement in the United States, seated largely at the University of Wisconsin by the progressives there. The great critical magazine of the time was called The Progressive, published on Gorham Street. Within walking distance of the state capitol, which was a big, huge domed edifice, and the highest building, Bascom Hall, that had a big dome, the University of Wisconsin on a hill, Bascom Hill. So that in between was a street called State Street, like Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., that here's the state capitol, here's the state university. And where you would have a handle to throw a javelin about 1/3 of the way from Bascom Hall towards the state capitol and 2/3 of the way back, the two great libraries, the State Historical Library and the University of Wisconsin Library, facing each other on a very large mall. And into this mall ran a simple one-block street called Murray Street. And the university owned all the houses on Murray Street. They were old houses. And eventually, the house that my roommates and I had 4 roommates, the 5 of us rented the whole upper floor of one of these houses for $75 a month, $15 a month each, and that's how poor boys got through university. And we worked jobs. I was a cook in an Italian restaurant for 4 years with a number of others. It had 70 tables, so it was a sizable restaurant. I can still cook, but I cook best for about 200 people. I can't make pizza for one. Where we lived, that is now the Elvium Art Museum of the University of Wisconsin. That house, the night before it was to be bulldozed, suddenly and mysteriously caught fire and had its own Norse Viking funeral, witnessed, oddly enough, by all of the people who had lived in that house for several decades. This is called the progressive movement. There is a particular quality to education when it is given a visionary dimension, a quintessential fifth dimension, which comes to a frequency registry in people who are like six-dimensional jewels, who not only understand it in themselves, but who share the understanding with others who have that understanding in themselves. And this is a different form of community from a political structure. The way it was talked about classically was that this is an aesthetic community. It resonates to truth, which they are able to share, so that not only are they personally, prismatically true, the community is true. Not based on the antithesicality of pro and con, but based on the shared understanding that a mutual pro and con process done classically will reach the aletheia, will reach that truth. And that community will be true in such a way that it is confirmable, not by a mental structure, and not just by the community understanding that they are not just right, but they are true, but because there will be a direct resonance with the cosmos. That the art of spiritual persons is confirmable because the cosmos recognizes you and recognizes the community of plural you. There is such a thing that the Renaissance understood. It is not only that a man is a microcosm, the community of men is also a microcosm, and that the cosmos recognizes and confers upon you not a medal of honor, not a property deed to wealth, not a political authority of control, but the confirmation of reality. The cosmos is interested in being real. It has all the real estate it needs. It has all the power it needs. Indeed, plenty of power to gift. Plenty of real estate to create more. What the cosmos does in its recognition is it blesses the art of the person, the artist, so that they are creative. It blesses the community of truth so that they flourish, and that the flourishing is not limited to the confines of time-space, that community can come back into scintillating play even after years, even after centuries, even after a millennia. And in Florence, two young artists that were there at the foundation of the Renaissance understood something that mutually they had reality in a cosmic way confirmed to them. The two artists were Donatello, a great sculptor, and Brunelleschi, a great architect. And those two Renaissance artists went together as pals, as buddies. They went to Rome, which at the time was no great shakes, except that it had enormous mounds of ruins. Classical buildings that had fallen during that 1,000-year dark age into ruin. And Brunelleschi and Donatello went with calipered eyes and a recalibrated understanding. And they patiently measured everything they could in Rome, in the ruins. And they came to understand secret proportions, untutored ratios that were really there, and I used to call those ratios of the real. And both Donatello and Brunelleschi learned to tone the art of seeing as artists and have it confirmed by the analytic science of cosmic reality. So that for the first time, Donatello could do a sculpture that was really sculptural and would hold its own with the greatest of all the classical works. And Brunelleschi, especially measuring the Pantheon, which was still there in Rome and is still there today, built by Agrippa, Augustus Caesar's great friend and eventually son-in-law. Agrippa's Pantheon still was there, and it was there that Brunelleschi learned the science of the structure of a dome and the art of the presentation of a new way to envision a dome, that you would have not only this great Roman Empire founding dome, but you would have a dome tuned between two domes where men could walk up on the outside of the dome of this world under the dome of the higher cosmic resonance and go all the way up to the top of the dome and stand in a cupola lantern that looked out over the entire city from the apex of the architecture, of the blessing of the real conferred on the art of man understanding who he was and who we are together, and that we can be real in ourselves and together. It is the ability to walk on the outside of man's limited sky under the confirmation of the resonance of the cosmos as a infinite dome. And Brunelleschi's great Duomo in Florence still stands today as one of the greatest buildings in the world. It was the model for Michelangelo's redoing of St. Peter's, where you can also walk up, if you have the energy and the tenacity, all the way to the top. One of the great Renaissance illustrations of this was a huge dome of the sky under which every power structure known to man was accumulated in a great tapestry of interplay, and yet one Hermetic man was able to peer outside of the covering of that sky dome and look beyond into the outside. This is an image from Plato's Timaeus. And the Timaeus itself is the culmination of Plato's whole development of an education. An education that is based upon a ratioing of the real that is confirmable because you can build structure architecturally by it. You can create art works which establish the spiritual truth of ourselves and our communities that receive the gift of reality from the cosmos. This can be done and is done. The key to the structure of the Timaeus is Pythagorean. The inverted Greek lambda with a 1 at the apex. If you come down one side in doubling, 2, 4, 8, 16. And on the other, you triple it, 3, 9, 27, etc. The ratioing of the doubling and the tripling will always produce a unity at the apex of the ratio's focus. Later on, it became, in astronomy, known as Bode's law. A planet orbiting a star, if you double its distance and triple its angular momentum, you will always come up with a ratioing that produces a 1. So that you can tell where the ones are by following this ratio all the way through. The planets in this star system, of course, follow Bode's law, which is universal. This is one of the ways in which the cosmos confirms reality on the truth found by the art of man. And so the science of the cosmos is the confirming by the gift of real on the achievement of men as themselves and in their communities. This outstrips political structures infinitely. And to rely upon political economic structures is one of the crippling aspects that is a flaw in all of the civilizations that have tried to be established among man. There will never again be a civilization in this star system based on political economy. It is going to be based upon the aesthetic creativity of our truth as persons, as community as large as the planet, that will be gifted with the reality of belonging in the cosmos. This is before us now, and this is what is happening now. As with someone like Plato, when he founded his academy, he founded it in 387 BC. He founded it because he went to Sicily several times to try to educate a young tyrant and his son to become philosopher kings, and they always betrayed him. And finally, they got tired of his penetrating look. Plato was a real aristocrat, and he could look through someone if he needed to. They sought to kill him, and his life was saved because a very wise, powerful king in southern Italy, Archelaus, sent for Plato and saved his life. Archelaus was the head of the whole Pythagorean intercity community of the world at that time. And he said to Plato, "You also must understand that while you develop yourself, you have the special given talent to develop a meeting between the cosmos and yourself, which is an educational structure which will help establish and tutor and, as a guardian spirit, train generations to come to build that community that bridges between your person and the cosmos, and not only bridges, but serves as the verification of the blessing of the real. Just as someone can become real to eternal life, a community of the real is able to be established so that it also has an infinite, eternal registry. So far, this has not happened permanently, continuously in any one place, but there are communities of the real that have been established for thousands of years all over the planet, and they are all able to be brought back into play by those alive now. Plato's Academy can be brought back. Benjamin Franklin's America can be brought back. Pythagoras' communities can be brought back. And it is this community of the planetary heritage that is going to be able to shine throughout the entire star system as a stellar civilization. And this is the time in which its seeding time is occurring. One of the interesting things about the Hermetic Roots of America that I finished in 1983, it was written under the aegis of the Philosophic Research Society here in Los Angeles. The president of that society, and the Philosophic Research Society is a variant of the American Philosophical Society established in Philadelphia by Benjamin Franklin. It's still there. One of the publications of the American Philosophical Society is this big tome, Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia Printing. And next week we'll get to the fact that Franklin was a universal man because his office, his printing business, printed everything. Printed the money, printed the treaties, printed the treatises of every group, printed the broadsides, printed Poor Richard's Almanac. He hand-set the complete cross-section of interplay of human beings for decades and trained others to do so. Franklin loaned money and talent to printers across the colonies so that they were all indebted to him like adopted sons. And in the Hermetica, it is the spiritual guardian who is the father, not a father figure, but a real father to real spirit sons, because they are able to do for themselves what you have done, and together constitute further resonances of the community able to receive the real. One of the earliest links of all of these colonies, all of these printing places, was the postal road. And Benjamin Franklin was the first postmaster general of what became the United States, because he understood the linking interplay, because he had the pulse of all of the real central places. The publishing industry in Franklin's time was the internet of its time. Now, the Hermetic Roots of America, the subtitle, first subtitle, Ficino's Renaissance to Franklin's Republic, is a period of about 250 years. This 250-year period, roughly from about 1439, when Ficino was chosen by Cosimo to be educated as his personal translator of Plato, chosen, as we said, because he was the son of his personal physician. That 1439 is when the confluence of religions was held in Florence to bring all the aspects of Christianity back into a single focus. Ficino became the great educator of the day. He was given as a place up in the hills of Florence, the Via Caregi. It is a venerable yellow stucco triple villa. In our own time, it was owned actually by Lawrence Rockefeller, who was a patron of mine for a decade. I was invited to go there in our time. That was the place that the teenager Michelangelo learned, the young Botticelli learned, the young genius Pico della Mirandola came with all of his genius and learned more. Ficino held forth, and one of his great holidays was Plato's birthday, November 13th, when he would have a huge banquet filled with disquisitions and singing and toasting, and brought back into play the whole spirit of the academy. And it was visiting individuals who came there who took back with them this tone. One of the individuals from England was named John Colet, who later took that Ficino, Cosimo de' Medici, Florentine Renaissance back to London and founded St. Paul's School in the center of London. And it was there at St. Paul's School that you began to have an English Renaissance that had its tunability with another resonance of that Renaissance in the Netherlands. And two of the closest friends there, one of Colet's confrères in England was Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, St. Thomas More, and in the Netherlands was Erasmus of Rotterdam. And it was Erasmus and More and Colet that made a combine of understanding that there was possible to have a new prism of education, but that this was going to take a while for it to mature. And the great maturation of that, of course, is Elizabethan England. And the greatest figure of that is Shakespeare. And we will see that Shakespeare is poignant because he points, like the Hermetica, to the development of the United States, which is inhabited by the spiritual person of Benjamin Franklin. One of the interesting aspects. Benjamin Franklin's mother, her maiden name was Folger. And the greatest Shakespeare library in the world is in Washington, D.C. It is the Folger Library. There are many Hermetic mysteries, almost unknown to the population at large. It is time to go to school. It is time to be tutored. The Hermetic roots of America goes through those centuries, person by person, major person by major person. And if you come to the prismatic center where the education was finally made, you come to the person of Jan Amos Comenius. And it was Comenius who understood that you have to bring the classic learning of a Platonic academy and its resonant successor, the Lyceum of Aristotle, and its predecessor, the Pythagorean communities, that you had to bring that into play in such a way that it was available to children universally. And he made the world's first school textbook with pictures for children of all classes, all levels of society. It's called the Orbis Pictus. And we'll take a long look in this series at how this worked. Comenius was from Prague, it wasn't called the Czech Republic, then it was called Bohemia. And it was very famous for its religious dissent. That is to say, there were many people by that time, we're talking about the middle of the 1600s, who had come to understand 150 years after Erasmus and Colet and Thomas More that the way in which the Bible was used as an authority of a power structure like the Pope and Roman Catholicism, like the Patriarch and Greek Orthodoxy, that all of this was a mask inhabited by personae in dramatic skits of political economy and had no confirmation of the real from the cosmos at all. Franklin, in his autobiography, relates to his son, William Franklin. He said, one of our ancestors who learned to read the Bible himself and would read the Bible to his family so that they could hear the Old Testament and the New Testament in accurate translations, it was against the law. If you were caught, you were imprisoned, and if you were caught again, you were killed. So Franklin tells his son, our ancestor used to tape the Bible to the bottom of a stool, and with one of the children looking out through the door to see if one of these officials coming to get you was not on the way, he would turn the stool over and he would read to the family the Bible in its actual truthfulness. And the first person to make a Bible truthful was Erasmus of Rotterdam, since who knows when. Because when we look at the manuscript traditions of the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, almost all of them have been, we use the polite term, fiddled with. They were corrupted by mistranslations and misappropriations based on the political economy authority structures of their time. And the most powerful structure of that time was the Roman Empire. And you find more distortion at that time than any other in world history. Franklin was writing this because he got to be 65 and he decided that he needed to pass on, like his ancestors had passed on, statements of what they had understood about life. And so he found himself going to this man's country house. His name is Jonathan Shipley. He was formerly the Bishop of Asaph. He was married into royalty so that he had deep connections in Britain, but he was also a champion of the dissenters publicly, and also a champion of the colonies being able to have more and more freedom, and he became one of Benjamin Franklin's closest friends. This is a letter to the Bishop of Asaph by Benjamin Franklin, June 24th, 1771, just a couple of months, 6 weeks before he went to stay with him for 3 weeks and wrote the beginnings of his autobiography there at his country home, Twyford, just outside of Winchester, England. Winchester is about 50 miles to the southwest of London, on the way down to Southampton. It's in Hamptonshire. If you went 50 miles northwest out of London, you would come to Northampton, England. The Franklin family have lived out in Ecton, a village like Twyford, just outside of Northampton, from time immemorial. Franklin found the earliest traces of the family there 300 years before his time. That's about 1400. Because before that time, his kind of people who were not royalty did not have family surnames. And so they, at that time, took family surnames, and they took the surname of Franklin, largely because in Chaucer, the Franklin's tale is one of the most noble tales in all of Chaucer, in all of world literature. In fact, Cambridge put out a beautiful, this is the old Phyllis Hodgson editing of Franklin tale from Chaucer. This is the new Cambridge, Franklin's Prologue and Tale. critical literature is huge. Chaucer's Franklin in the Canterbury Tales, and here is the conclusion, because the Franklin was a free man who was not royal, but who was a property owner and a creative genius for the community. With respect to Chaucer's delineation of the Franklin's character, exception has been taken to the Luminisky school of critics, primarily because the assumptions which appear to lie behind their strong emphasis on Franklin's social self-consciousness and alleged social aspirations seem to be largely unwarranted by the historical evidence for the social identity of the 14th century, 1300s, Chaucer's age. He died in 1400. He was born in 1340. 600 years to the day from my birth. Chaucer's Franklin would hardly have aspired to a social status group of which he was already an esteemed and honorable member. He didn't have to aspire. We can only guess at what motives prompted Chaucer to represent as a Franklin the noble and thoroughly human character which it has been argued in this book that he intended to delineate. The Franklin in Chaucer is a noble figure in himself who puts his energies into creating aspects of the society to generate the community that can receive the true. It is in Benjamin Franklin's letter, which we'll come back to next week, to the Bishop of Asaph, that he says, I have come to the age where I must divulge what has occurred in my life, that I have received such blessings. And the greatest gift of all, I am real, I know, in God's eyes, in this cosmos. And I am able to share what it is of me by developing aspects of myself through gifts of the real so that they really get done. One of the great qualities of Franklin, which we will come back to immediately next week, is this beautiful frontispiece, Benjamin Franklin's Experiments, a new edition of Franklin's Experiments and Observations on Electricity. And I will make a JPEG and bring enlarged. This is Franklin snatching the lightning from the old mythological skies and putting it to work as electricity for man. He's the figure who did that. He literally electrified human civilization. He sent a copy of this book in its original edition to the 15-year-old daughter of the Bishop of Asaph, along with some dried apples from America for Mrs. Shipley, to make sure that she could appreciate that the colonies were coming up with new inventions, like preserving the fine, sweet summer apples all the way through the year. He said, well, of course, the container has come a little unjarred from its shipping so that there'll be a little bit of American dust, but if you soak them in English warm water for a little bit and quickly tamp them with a towel, they will be delicious apples again. And I will show you how you may do it with your own apples. Characteristic of Benjamin Franklin. He was able finally in his old age, at age 80, to leave Paris and come back to the United States in time for the Constitutional Convention, because he could not leave until someone of capacity came to replace him. So important and so delicate was the relationship with France. Finally, Thomas Jefferson came. Benjamin Franklin wrote to his sister, Jane Mecom, who was extremely intelligent. He said, I can come home now. Mr. Jefferson has arrived and he can take care of everything. When Jefferson left Paris, the night before, his final dinner had all of the leaders of the French Revolution at the table, including Lafayette, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the morning, just before dawn, as Jefferson's coach was hustling out of Paris towards Calais to get the packet steamer, not steamer, but ship to America, the French Revolution broke out. We're talking about Hermetic America because it is contagious. And the entire planet is coming alive. The entire star system is coming alive. Good reason for others of other star systems to come and witness the birth of one of the best stellar civilizations that will ever become real. More next week.